Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back, way back, to a time when your local brewery wasn't just a fun weekend spot, but a vital cog in the national economy, and arguably the engine of civilization itself. Imagine, if you will, the scorching sun beating down on the fertile banks of the Nile, the air thick with the scent of fermenting grain, dust motes dancing in the golden light. You're trudging through fields of barley, sweat trickling down your brow, not thinking about your next paycheck, but about your next pint. Because in ancient Egypt, that pint, or rather, the ingredients for it, wasn't just a beverage. It was often the very currency of your existence. Forget gold, forget silver. You're paying your taxes, you're earning your living, you're even building monumental pyramids, all with the amber liquid that is beer. You probably wouldn't survive a week, let alone a month, in this society without developing a deep appreciation for the brew, or at least its economic power. The concept of liquid assets truly takes on a new meaning here, doesn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to imagine us, all, scattered across the globe, united by a shared curiosity about the quirks of history. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a bustling ancient Egyptian town, the air thick with the aroma of freshly baked bread, and yes, that distinct, yeasty tang of brewing beer. You glance at a laborer wiping his brow, and instead of pulling out a coin purse, he's hefting a clay jar. This isn't a casual drink. This is his payment, his livelihood, and the very foundation of the Pharaoh's treasury. It might sound ludicrous to our modern ears, accustomed to intricate financial systems and digital transactions, but for millennia, from roughly 3100 BCE right up until the Roman period, ancient Egypt ran, in no small part, on beer. This wasn't some niche commodity. It was the lifeblood of the economy, especially for the vast majority of the population who weren't dealing in rare metals or precious gems. You see, the concept of a standardized coinage system, as we know it, didn't really exist for much of ancient Egyptian history. Instead, they operated on a barter economy, heavily reliant on staples. And what was more staple than beer? A drink that was safe, nutritious, and ubiquitous. You couldn't exactly pay the guy who built your wall with a bag of exotic spices from Punt, could you? Well, you could, but it'd be awkward. Beer was far more practical. Historians still argue whether the exact alcoholic content of this ancient brew was consistent across all batches, or if some were closer to a sort of beer bread mash, designed more for sustenance than intoxication. But what is clear is its role as a fundamental unit of value. Imagine setting up your annual budget meeting, and instead of talking about dollars or euros, you're discussing how many hekat, a unit of volume, roughly 4.8 liters, of beer are coming in and how many are going out. It sounds like a party, doesn't it? But it was serious business. From the lowliest field worker to the skilled artisan carving hieroglyphs, a portion of their labor or their produce was often assessed in terms of beer. This wasn't just about paying taxes. It was about the state providing sustenance, effectively redistributing wealth in a highly practical, if somewhat tipsy, manner. The very definition of liquid assets was quite literal here, allowing for easy division, transportation, relatively speaking, and consumption. It made perfect sense in a society where grain was plentiful and the need for a universally accepted medium of exchange was paramount. You watch as a group of laborers, their muscles rippling under the Egyptian sun, unload baskets of barley from a boat docked on the Nile. This isn't just any barley. This is the raw material, the very foundation of the liquid economy you now inhabit. To truly grasp how beer became the ancient equivalent of cash, you need to understand how it was made. Forget shiny fermentation tanks and precise temperature controls. The brewing process back then was far more earthy. You'd start with grain, usually barley, sometimes emmer wheat, which would be coarsely ground. This wasn't flour for bread, but a rough grist, enough to break open the kernels. Then, this ground grain would often be lightly baked into a dense, unleavened bread. Imagine a slightly burnt, very dry biscuit. This beer bread served a crucial purpose. It helped to malta the grain, activating enzymes that would convert starches into fermentable sugars. It also made the grain easier to store and transport before the actual brewing process began. Next, this beer bread would be crumbled into large vats, often made of pottery, and mixed with water. This mash would then sit, usually for a few days, in the warm Egyptian climate. There was no added yeast in the modern sense. Wild yeasts, abundant in the air and on the grains themselves, would naturally kickstart the fermentation. You might notice flies buzzing around, a less than appetizing thought, but a natural part of the process. The mixture would foam and bubble, a clear sign that the magic was happening. Sometimes dates or honey would be added for extra sweetness and to boost the alcohol content, though this was less common for the everyday working class brew. After fermentation, the liquid would be strained, often through sieves made of reeds or cloth, to remove the spent grain and other solids. What you were left with was a thick, cloudy, and surprisingly nutritious beverage. It wasn't the clear, effervescent lager you might enjoy today. It was more akin to a thick, gritty gruel, often described as having a sour, slightly sweet taste. This rough and ready brewing method meant consistency wasn't exactly a hallmark. Each batch could vary wildly in strength and flavor. Historians still argue whether different regions had distinct brewing styles, or if variations were more a matter of individual household practice. One quirky tidbit: some analyses of ancient Egyptian brewing residues suggest they sometimes added small amounts of specific herbs or spices, not just for flavor, but possibly for their preservative qualities, or even for mild medicinal effects. Imagine a hint of chamomile in your daily brew, perhaps to help you relax after a long day of pyramid building. It certainly puts our modern craft beer obsession into perspective. They were truly fermenting everything in sight. You can almost hear the ancient brewers debating the merits of one wild yeast strain over another, or complaining about a particularly stubborn batch. The lack of precise control meant a good brewer was highly valued, relying on experience and a keen nose to judge the readiness of the mash. With the brewing process in mind, you can begin to truly appreciate how integral beer was to ancient Egyptian life. This wasn't a luxury item tucked away for special occasions. It was a daily necessity consumed by everyone, from the smallest child to the mightiest pharaoh. Imagine your morning coffee, but instead, it's a thick, slightly sour beer that provides not just hydration, but a significant portion of your daily calories. Laborers building temples and tombs would drink several liters of beer a day, not for recreation, but as their primary source of energy and nourishment. It was safer to drink than the often contaminated Nile water, as the fermentation process killed off many harmful bacteria. So, you're not just enjoying a casual beverage, you're actively preventing dysentery, which, let's be honest, is a pretty good reason to develop a taste for it. Children, too, drank beer, though likely a much weaker, less alcoholic version. Think of it less as an intoxicating drink and more as a nutritious gruel or liquid bread. It was packed with carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals. Some historians even suggest that the relatively good health and strength of the ancient Egyptians, despite their often physically demanding lives, can be partly attributed to their high beer consumption. It was a crucial part of their dietary pyramid, if you will, the broad base upon which much of their caloric intake rested. You can almost see a mother handing her child a small cup of watered down beer just as readily as a modern parent might offer a glass of milk. This ubiquity meant that beer was consumed at every level of society. The richest nobles and the poorest peasants alike drank it, though the quality and quantity might have varied. A pharaoh might have access to a finer, perhaps flavored, brew, while a field worker settled for the basic, thick variety. But the fundamental presence was universal. You wouldn't find a dinner table without it, any more than you'd find one without bread. It was the fundamental fuel. One quirky tidbit: some tomb paintings actually depict people drinking beer through long straws, which suggests the brew was often so thick with sediment that a straw was practical for avoiding the gritty bits at the bottom. Imagine trying to use a modern, flimsy straw for that. It puts a new spin on straw man argument, doesn't it? The pervasive nature of beer also highlights a fascinating aspect of ancient Egyptian culture: their practicality. They weren't just thinking about taste, they were thinking about sustenance, safety, and efficiency. Historians still argue whether the invention of beer actually predates or coincided with the earliest forms of bread, or if they evolved in tandem from similar grain processing techniques. Regardless, the importance of this fermented beverage as a dietary staple cannot be overstated. It was the bedrock of their existence, providing both physical sustenance and a sense of shared cultural identity. So, the next time you toast with a cold one, remember its ancient ancestor, a cloudy, gritty, life giving brew that fueled one of the greatest civilizations in history. Given beer's monumental role in daily life, it starts to make perfect sense why it became such a central element in the ancient Egyptian economy, particularly when it came to taxation. Imagine trying to collect taxes in a society that largely operated without a standardized coinage system. Gold and silver existed, yes, but they were often reserved for large scale transactions, international trade, or the very elite. For the vast majority of people, something more tangible, more accessible, and more consistently produced was needed. And that's where beer, or rather, the raw materials for beer, stepped in. The practical reasons for beer as currency are quite compelling. Firstly, grain was the bedrock of Egyptian agriculture, and by extension, its economy. Harvests were predictable, and grain was relatively easy to store and transport, especially when compared to perishable goods. Converting that grain into beer not only made it safer to consume, but also added value through a labor intensive process. So, when you paid your taxes in beer, you weren't just handing over a commodity, you were essentially paying in processed agricultural output, a refined product of the land and human effort. It was a tangible representation of wealth and productivity. Secondly, beer was divisible and measurable. While perhaps not as precise as modern currency, large clay jars of beer, or their equivalent in grain for brewing, could be standardized into units of value. This meant that tax assessments could be made and payments could be received in consistent quantities. A craftsman might receive X jars of beer for his work and then pay Y jars of beer as his annual tax. It simplified transactions in a way that bartering for, say, a cow or a bolt of linen wouldn't. Historians still argue whether the Hecat unit of volume, which we mentioned earlier, was strictly uniform across all periods and regions, or if there were slight variations. But the intent was clearly to establish a reliable measure. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, beer was universally desired and consumed. Everyone needed it, everyone drank it. This made it a highly liquid asset, pun absolutely intended. If the government collected beer as tax, they knew they could easily redistribute it as wages to laborers, soldiers, and civil servants, or use it to provision state run projects like pyramid construction. It was a self sustaining economic loop. You pay your taxes in beer, the government pays its workers in beer, the workers drink the beer and stay productive, and the cycle continues. It was far more practical than collecting, say, bushels of flax or bundles of papyrus, which might have limited immediate utility for widespread distribution. One quirky tidbit: some economists refer to this kind of system as a commodity money system, where a physical good with inherent value serves as currency, much like gold once did. It's a fascinating glimpse into the evolution of economic thought, ancient style. You see, the ancient Egyptians weren't just great builders, they were incredibly savvy economic planners too, in their own unique way. With beer established as a key economic pillar, you might wonder who controlled its production and distribution. The answer, not surprisingly, points directly to the heart of ancient Egyptian power: the pharaoh and the state. Far from being a laissez faire economy where anyone could brew as much as they liked, the production of beer was largely a state controlled enterprise, or at least heavily regulated. This wasn't just about ensuring quality, though that was certainly a concern, especially if you were paying your armies in it. It was fundamentally about controlling a vital resource and, by extension, controlling the populace and the economy. Imagine the sheer scale of the operation. You're not just talking about individual families brewing a few jars for their own consumption. You're envisioning vast state-run breweries, often attached to temples or administrative centers, churning out enormous quantities of beer to fuel the workforce, pay the military, and stock the royal granaries. This centralized control meant that the state could effectively manage supply and demand, ensuring that there was always enough beer for taxes, wages, and state projects. It also meant that the quality, however basic, was somewhat standardized. You wouldn't want a rogue brewer accidentally intoxicating the entire workforce building your new pyramid, would you? That would be a truly unproductive day. The pharaoh's authority over beer production was a direct extension of his control over agriculture, particularly the cultivation of barley and emmer wheat. Since these grains were the primary ingredients, controlling their supply meant controlling the beer output. Royal granaries stored vast amounts of grain, not just for food, but for brewing. This strategic management allowed the state to collect taxes in grain, convert it into beer, and then disperse that beer as payment or provision. It was a brilliantly self-contained system. Historians still argue whether every single brewery was directly managed by the state, or if there was a mix of state-owned and privately run, but heavily licensed operations. What is clear is the overarching state oversight. There were officials, sometimes referred to as beer inspectors or supervisors of the brewery, whose job it was to ensure that the brewing process was efficient and that the output met certain standards. One quirky tidbit: some texts mention beer rations explicitly, detailing the specific amounts of beer due to various categories of workers and officials. This further reinforces the idea of beer as a controlled, standardized unit of value, much like a salary in our modern terms. It wasn't just a drink, it was a carefully managed asset flowing from the fields through the state-controlled breweries and into the hands of the people, all under the watchful eye of the pharaoh. It's almost like the original big government enterprise, but with a much more delicious product. With such a critical commodity like beer fueling the economy, you can imagine the sheer amount of record keeping involved. This wasn't a casual hand over a pot of beer and call it a day system. The ancient Egyptians were masters of administration, and their scribes, those meticulous record keepers of antiquity, were at the heart of it. Picture a busy administrative office, perhaps near a temple or a royal granary. You see scribes seated cross-legged, their papyrus scrolls or ostraca, pottery, shards used for notes, laid out before them. They're dipping their reeds into ink, diligently recording every single transaction, every delivery, every disbursement of beer. These records weren't just about tracking who paid what. They were about maintaining the entire economic infrastructure, every field of barley, every batch brewed, every ration distributed to workers. It all had to be accounted for. These detailed lists would often specify the individual's name, their profession, the amount of beer owed, the amount paid, and any outstanding balance. It was effectively their version of a ledger, a tax roll, and a payroll all rolled into one. If you were a worker, your name would appear on a list, noting how much beer you received as wages for your labor on a particular project, perhaps a temple construction or canal maintenance. If you were a farmer, the amount of grain you produced, and thus the beer equivalent you owed in taxes, would be carefully documented. This meticulousness extended to inventory management as well. Scribes would track the stock levels in granaries and breweries, ensuring there was always enough beer to meet the state's obligations. Imagine the complexity of managing a liquid commodity that could spoil if not stored properly or if left in the wrong conditions. Historians still argue about the exact methods they used for long term beer storage beyond simple pottery jars, and whether they had advanced preservation techniques. But the fact that they managed such vast quantities suggests a sophisticated understanding of logistics. One quirky tidbit: some of these surviving administrative texts even contain complaints from workers about the quality or quantity of their beer rations. Imagine filing a grievance in ancient Egypt because your beer was watered down. It truly shows how central this commodity was to their daily lives and sense of fairness. These scribes weren't just accountants, they were the guardians of economic order, ensuring that the beer economy flowed smoothly from the fields to the workers' mouths. You can almost hear the soft scratching of their reeds on papyrus, the murmuring of figures as the very lifeblood of the Egyptian state was meticulously tallied, one hecate of beer at a time. It highlights that even in ancient times, the taxman always called, and he expected his liquid payment. So, you've got the grain, you've got the brewing, and you've got the meticulous scribes counting every drop. Now, imagine the logistical challenge of moving and storing these vast quantities of beer. This wasn't just about collecting taxes, it was about ensuring that beer, as the primary form of payment and sustenance, could reach every corner of the vast Egyptian kingdom. You're not just talking about a few barrels, you're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of liters of liquid moving through the ancient infrastructure. The primary vessels for transportation and storage were large pottery jars, often conical in shape, designed to be stacked or carried. These weren't exactly light. Imagine rows upon rows of these jars, filled with thick, fermented beer, lined up in state storerooms, or being loaded onto Nile boats. The Nile itself was the superhighway of ancient Egypt, and boats were the primary means of bulk transport. You'd see vessels laden not just with grain, but with these distinctive beer jars, heading downriver to construction sites, military garrisons, or provincial administrative centers. This reliance on river transport highlights the geographical genius of Egyptian civilization, with the Nile acting as a ready made, highly efficient delivery system. Upon arrival at a destination, the beer would be unloaded and stored in state, granaries, or dedicated beer houses. These weren't just simple sheds, they were often substantial structures designed to keep the contents as cool and stable as possible in the sweltering Egyptian climate. While refrigeration was obviously out of the question, the Egyptians understood the importance of shade, thick walls, and ventilation to minimize spoilage. You can almost feel the cooler air as you step into one of these ancient storerooms, a welcome respite from the scorching sun outside. Historians still argue about the precise shelf life of this ancient beer. Given its thick, cloudy nature and the presence of live yeast, it likely didn't last indefinitely, perhaps only a few weeks to a few months before it began to turn unpalatable. This limited shelf life meant that distribution had to be constant and efficient. It wasn't a commodity that could be hoarded for years. One quirky tidbit: some tomb reliefs show scenes of banquets where servants are seen actively cooling beer jars in bowls of water, sometimes fanning them, suggesting that even in ancient times, a slightly chilled brew was preferred, even if true. Refrigeration was a dream of the distant future. It's funny to think about, isn't it? The Egyptians, with all their advanced engineering for pyramids, were still struggling with a warm beer problem, just like we sometimes do today. The logistics of this beer economy were a monumental undertaking, a testament to their organizational prowess. As you follow the journey of the beer from the fields to the tables, you can't help but wonder about the people who made it all happen, the ancient Egyptian brewers. This wasn't a casual hobby, it was a demanding, vital profession, integral to the entire economic and social fabric. Imagine waking before dawn, the air already warming, and heading to the state brewery or a large estate's production facility. Your day would be filled with heavy labor, repetitive tasks, and the constant, pungent aroma of fermentation. A brewer's job involved everything from managing the malting process, ensuring the grain germinated just enough to release its sugars, to grinding the grain, baking the beer bread, mixing the mash, and overseeing the fermentation. It required a keen eye, a good sense of smell, and a hefty dose of patience. You couldn't just set it and forget it with wild yeast. You had to monitor the process, recognizing the subtle signs of a good fermentation versus one that was going sour. This wasn't a job for the faint of heart or for someone with a weak back. The vats were large, the ingredients heavy, and the finished product even heavier when in jars. You'd be constantly stirring, straining, and lifting. Despite the physical demands, the role of a brewer was often a respected one, particularly for those working in large state or temple breweries. They were providing a fundamental necessity, contributing directly to the sustenance and economic well being of the entire population. It was a craft passed down through generations, with techniques and secrets refined over centuries. Historians still argue about the exact gender roles in ancient Egyptian brewing, while some evidence points to men dominating large scale state breweries. Other depictions and texts suggest that women often played a significant role in household or smaller scale brewing, especially in earlier periods. It's a fascinating debate about the division of labor in such a crucial industry. One quirky tidbit that brings a smile to your face: some ancient Egyptian texts actually contain spells or incantations related to brewing, intended to ensure a good batch or protect against spoilage. Imagine a brewer muttering a little chant over his mash, hoping for divine intervention for a perfect pint. It adds a touch of magical realism to what was otherwise a very practical and laborious profession. These brewers weren't just making a drink, they were quite literally crafting the liquid currency that greased the wheels of one of history's greatest civilizations. Their skill, diligence, and even their superstitions played a crucial role in keeping the ancient Egyptian world flowing. Beyond its economic and sustenance roles, beer played a profound part in the social fabric of ancient Egypt. It wasn't just a tax payment or a wage, it was a medium for celebration, a component of religious rituals, and a lubricant for social interactions. Imagine walking through a bustling marketplace. You'd hear not just the haggling over goods, but the clinking of pottery jars and the cheerful shouts of people sharing a communal drink. Beer was deeply intertwined with festivities and gatherings, feasts, whether for religious holidays, successful harvests, or personal celebrations, were almost always accompanied by generous quantities of beer. It fostered a sense of community and camaraderie. You can picture friends unwinding after a long day in the fields, sharing a jug and gossiping about the latest Nile flood or the peculiar antics of a neighbor's donkey. It might have offered a welcome escape from the often harsh realities of life, providing a mild buzz that helped to relax and connect people. But beer's social impact wasn't limited to everyday life. It held significant importance in religious practices and offerings. You would often see beer jars placed as offerings in tombs, intended to sustain the deceased in the afterlife. Temples also received vast quantities of beer as offerings to the gods, a tangible symbol of gratitude and devotion. It was believed that even the deities enjoyed a good brew. In some rituals, priests would drink beer as part of the ceremony, perhaps to induce a trance like state, or simply to honor the gods. One quirky tidbit: there are depictions of beer goddesses like Tenenet, who was believed to oversee the brewing process, further solidifying the sacred connection of the beverage. Historians still argue about the extent to which public drunkenness was tolerated or condemned. While moderation was generally encouraged, tomb scenes occasionally depict individuals in states of inebriation, suggesting that occasional overindulgence was not entirely uncommon, especially during festivals. It highlights a very human aspect of ancient Egyptian society, where even a substance as vital as beer could sometimes lead to playful excess. The pervasive presence of beer meant it blurred the lines between nourishment, commerce, and social bonding, making it an indispensable part of what it meant to be an ancient Egyptian. You can almost feel the gentle hum of conversation and the convivial atmosphere that a shared jar of this ancient brew would have brought. While beer certainly dominated the economic landscape for many, you shouldn't imagine a monolithic system where only beer was accepted as payment or tribute. Ancient Egypt, though remarkably consistent for millennia, was also a practical civilization, and other commodities certainly played a role in its complex economic exchanges. You might observe different transactions happening around you, reflecting the diversity of goods produced and consumed. Grain itself, particularly barley and emmer, remained a fundamental form of payment and tax, especially for large scale agricultural output. If you were a farmer, you might pay your taxes directly in bushels of grain, which could then be stored in state granaries and later converted into beer, bread, or animal fodder. It was the raw, foundational wealth of the land, easily measurable and storable. Imagine the vast granaries filled to the brim after a successful harvest, representing the true treasury of the pharaoh. Beyond grain and beer, other valuable goods served as forms of tribute or specialized payment. Linen, for instance, was a crucial commodity, as Egypt was a major producer of flax. Fine linen textiles were highly prized, and skilled weavers might be paid in quantities of this cloth, or certain taxes might be levied in bolts of linen. You might see a craftsman receiving a carefully folded stack of linen as part of his wage rather than a jar of beer, especially if his work was for a higher status individual or institution. Precious metals like gold, silver, and copper, while not typically used for daily transactions by the common person, were vital for larger state expenditures, international trade, and the payment of high ranking officials or specialized artisans. Gold, mined from the deserts, was especially valuable. You wouldn't pay your daily bread bill with a gold ring, but a temple might pay a master sculptor in a quantity of precious metal for an elaborate statue. Historians still argue about the precise exchange rates between these various commodities and how often these rates fluctuated based on supply, demand, or royal decrees. One quirky tidbit is the use of rations of food and other goods as a direct form of payment. Workers on state projects, particularly the massive construction endeavors, weren't just paid in beer. Their daily wage often included a set amount of bread, vegetables, and sometimes even fish or meat, supplementing their beer rations. This holistic approach to payment ensured their sustenance and continued productivity, preventing them from needing to purchase essential foodstuffs themselves. You might see a supervisor doling out portions of various items to a line of tired laborers, a true embodiment of the state providing for its workforce. So, while beer was king, it certainly had a retinue of other valuable goods supporting the ancient Egyptian economic throne. With taxes being collected in beer and grain, and these commodities being so central to daily life, it's inevitable that some individuals would try to find ways around the system. You might see whispers and furtive glances, the telltale signs of ancient tax evasion. While the pharaoh's grip on the economy was strong, human nature, it seems, hasn't changed much over the millennia. People have always looked for loopholes, even when those loopholes involved sticky, fermenting liquid. One of the most straightforward methods of evasion would have involved underreporting harvests. If you were a farmer, the amount of grain you declared for taxation would directly impact the amount of beer or grain you owed. Imagine subtly reducing your reported yield, perhaps by claiming a patch of land was less fertile than it actually was, or that pests had taken a larger bite out of your crops than they truly had. This would have been a constant cat and mouse game between the farmers and the tax assessors, who, no doubt, had their own methods for estimating yields and spotting discrepancies. Another, perhaps more ingenious, method for brewers might have involved diluting the beer intended for state payment. If the quality or strength of the beer wasn't strictly controlled, a brewer might try to stretch their supply by adding more water, thus increasing the volume they could claim as tax payment while actually using less grain. This would be a risky maneuver, of course, as a diligent inspector might notice the inferior quality, leading to fines or other punishments. You can almost hear the grumbling of a tax collector who receives a batch of unusually watery brew, suspecting foul play. Historians still argue about the prevalence and success rates of such tax evasion tactics. While detailed records suggest a highly organized system, the sheer size of the population and the vastness of the territory would have made perfect oversight impossible. There would have been opportunities for corruption and cunning. One quirky tidbit: some legal texts from later periods actually describe penalties for false declarations of goods, which would certainly have applied to grain and beer. Imagine being caught trying to sneak a few jars past the tax collector, only to face the wrath of a stern scribe and a hefty fine, perhaps even more beer. It just goes to show that the timeless struggle between the taxpayer and the tax collector is a narrative as old as civilization itself, fueled in ancient Egypt by a good, if sometimes diluted, brew. You've seen the beer flow from field to Pharaoh, but what was its broader impact? The system of beer taxation and beer as a general form of payment had significant ripple effects throughout the entire ancient Egyptian economy. It wasn't just a quirky historical fact. It shaped labor, trade, and even the very structure of society. Firstly, it created a highly standardized labor force by paying workers in consistent rations of beer and bread. The state could mobilize vast numbers of people for monumental projects. Imagine thousands of laborers toiling on the pyramids, knowing that their daily sustenance, their literal fuel, would be delivered in the form of these reliable beer rations. This allowed for immense state control over the workforce, ensuring that resources were always available to accomplish ambitious goals, whether it was building a temple or digging a new irrigation canal. It's a very different system from our modern cash economy, where labor mobility is much higher. Here, your wages were tied to your immediate survival, making you less likely to simply up and leave. Secondly, the beer economy fostered internal trade and specialization. While the state controlled large-scale production, smaller, localized exchanges still occurred. You might be a potter specializing in crafting beer jars, and your income would be directly linked to the demand for these vessels. A fisherman might trade his catch for beer, or a weaver might exchange linen for grain that could then be brewed. This created a robust internal market where commodities with inherent value, like beer, facilitated transactions even without a universal coin. Historians still argue about the precise mechanisms of bartering and whether a fixed system of equivalencies existed, or if it was more fluid based on immediate need. One quirky tidbit: the very existence of a beer tax indirectly promoted agricultural stability. Since grain was the foundation of beer, the state had a vested interest in ensuring bountiful harvests and effective irrigation systems. Any disruption to the grain supply would directly impact the beer economy, and thus the state's ability to pay its workers and feed its population. So, in a way, the beer economy incentivized good agricultural practices and strong central planning, which in turn supported the longevity of the civilization. It's funny how something as seemingly simple as a fermented beverage could have such a profound and complex impact on an entire civilization's economic framework. It was a clever, practical solution to the challenges of managing a vast agrarian society. You might wonder if this omnipresent beer economy extended beyond the borders of ancient Egypt, influencing its foreign trade. While the bulk of beer production and consumption was decidedly internal, dedicated to feeding and paying the domestic population. There are intriguing glimpses into its role, or lack thereof, in international exchanges. For the most part, ancient Egyptian beer was not a primary export commodity in the same way that, say, papyrus, linen, or gold might have been. Imagine trying to transport large quantities of perishable, thick beer across vast deserts or turbulent seas to distant lands. It would have been incredibly inefficient and prone to spoilage. So, you wouldn't typically see Egyptian merchant ships laden with beer jars heading to Mesopotamia or the Aegean. Their international trade was more focused on high value, non perishable goods or raw materials that were scarce in Egypt. However, beer could have played an indirect role in foreign relations or as a gift. Perhaps a pharaoh might send a special, particularly fine brew as a diplomatic offering to a friendly ruler, a gesture of goodwill rather than a commercial transaction. Think of it as a historical equivalent of gifting a rare bottle of wine, a symbol of luxury and unique production, not a bulk commodity for trade. Such gifts, if they occurred, would have been rare and highly symbolic. Historians still argue whether there's definitive archaeological evidence of Egyptian beer being regularly consumed in significant quantities outside its borders, beyond incidental findings. One quirky tidbit comes from the discovery of foreign made pottery in Egypt, sometimes suggesting that foreign peoples adopted Egyptian brewing styles or even brewed their own versions of the thick, nutritious beer. The influence wasn't necessarily through export, but through the spread of knowledge and cultural practices. So, while Egyptian beer itself didn't traverse the ancient world as a major trade good, the idea of its specific type of nutritious brew might have. You can almost picture a foreign dignitary visiting Egypt, developing a taste for the local brew, and then attempting to replicate it back home, perhaps with limited success given the local ingredients and brewing conditions. This underlines that while beer was the lifeblood within Egypt, its true international impact was more subtle and cultural than commercial. You've traversed millennia with the ancient Egyptians, witnessing beer's reign as a currency, a food, staple, and a social lubricator. But, like all dominant systems, the beer based economy eventually began to fade. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but rather a gradual shift influenced by changing political landscapes and the introduction of new economic paradigms. The most significant factor in the decline of beer as a primary form of currency was the rise of standardized coinage. While sporadic use of metal weights for transactions existed much earlier, the widespread adoption of coined money began to gain traction during the late period, especially with the influx of foreign influences such as the Greeks and later the Romans. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he brought with him a fully developed monetary economy. Imagine the practical shift. Instead of hauling jars of beer to pay your taxes, you could now use small, easily transportable metal discs with a standardized value. This offered unparalleled convenience and precision that the beer economy simply couldn't match. As the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek rulers after Alexander, and then the Roman Empire took control, their more sophisticated financial systems, including comprehensive coinage, were gradually implemented. While beer still remained a popular beverage and a crucial food source, its role as the backbone of taxation and wages diminished significantly. The state began to prefer collecting taxes in coinage, which was far easier to assess, store, and manage for a vast multi ethnic empire. Paying soldiers and administrators in standardized coins also streamlined logistical operations that had become incredibly complex under the old system. Historians still argue about the exact pace of this transition and whether older, beer based practices coexisted with coinage for a significant period before fully disappearing. One quirky tidbit is that even as coinage became prevalent, the cultural significance of beer persisted. It remained a beloved drink, consumed daily, and continued to be featured in religious offerings and social gatherings. So, while its economic clout waned, its place in the heart of Egyptian culture endured. Think of it like a beloved traditional food that might no longer be a staple currency, but is still deeply cherished and widely consumed. The ancient Egyptians didn't stop drinking beer, they just started paying for it and everything else with shiny new coins instead of dusty old jars. It marks a quiet but profound shift from a liquid asset to a metallic one, signaling the end of an era. So, you've witnessed the journey of beer from ancient currency to a beloved cultural relic. But the story doesn't quite end there. The echoes of this fascinating system, where taxes were paid in liquid gold, surprisingly resonate even in our modern world. It's a testament to how deeply ingrained certain practical solutions become in human societies. Think about it. While we no longer pay our taxes in beer, thankfully, that would make tax season even more complicated. The concept of commodity money still exists in various forms. In some remote or developing communities, goods like livestock, specific crops, or even valuable services might still function as de facto currency, much like grain and beer once did. And even in highly monetized economies, the value of certain raw materials or agricultural products can still significantly impact the national wealth and trade, much as barley harvests influenced ancient Egypt. More subtly, the ancient Egyptian system foreshadowed modern rationing and welfare programs. The state's provision of beer and bread to its workers wasn't just payment, it was a comprehensive social safety net, ensuring basic sustenance for the populace. This direct provision of essentials by the government, though vastly different in scale and intent, finds a conceptual parallel in today's food assistance programs, housing subsidies, or even military provisions. Historians still argue about the precise motivations behind the state's comprehensive welfare, whether it was purely pragmatic for labor control or also driven by a sense of social responsibility. One quirky tidbit that might make you chuckle: the enduring human fascination with beer, even today. Craft breweries are popping up everywhere, and people are experimenting with ancient recipes, sometimes trying to recreate those thick, cloudy Egyptian brews. It seems that despite millennia of economic evolution, the humble fermented grain continues to hold a special, almost sacred, place in our collective human experience. From fueling pyramids to inspiring modern microbrews, beer's journey is truly remarkable. As the echoes of the bustling ancient breweries begin to fade, and the dusty scrolls of tax records are quietly rolled up, you can feel the gentle hum of history settling around you. The sun dips below the horizon of your mind's eye, casting long shadows over the imaginary Nile. The distant sounds of ancient life soften, becoming a soothing murmur, like the gentle lapping of water against a reed boat. You've walked with pharaohs, toiled with laborers, and shared a quiet moment with a scribe, all fueled by the surprising reality of beer as the lifeblood of a civilization. Now, let your thoughts drift like the slow moving currents of the Nile, carrying away any lingering worries, the weight of ancient taxes, the meticulous counting of jars, the rich history of a bygone era. Let it all dissolve into a comforting haze. Feel the quiet envelop you, the world outside receding. You are safe. You are still. And the whispers of history are guiding you gently into a deep, peaceful sleep.